Well, Dr. Jones, it is such a pleasure to meet you this morning. It really is. You are one of my heroes. And I've always wondered how you and Dr. Bland and the other founders of functional medicine, how you in the late 90s, when we had a lot of specialization in medical fields and we had managed care dictating how we are to treat patients, um, how you were in that atmosphere to come up with a way to integrate all the best that we have in medicine and to make it uh, more integrated, more of a partnership.
When I look back and think about it, it's hard for me not to feel some degree of guidance that I will not put a label on. But a sense, I went to medical school. I grew up in a family that was from the Midwest, uneducated, essentially uneducated, one room schoolhouse, and they stopped in the 8th grade, but a real belief in education. And I always wanted to be a doctor, but I never told anybody because nobody in my extended family of probably 200 people had postgraduate education, even let alone to be a doctor. So my original degree was in English literature and linguistics. And it was a wonderful field that prepared me to be a doctor, actually, more than much of the science that I took. Because a well-written book is the distillation of a person's thought as best they can say it. And education allows you to enter that world that they want you to share with them. And once I became a doctor, I realized that I had to do something about the way I was educated. I was 3 years into practice in family medicine in Ashland, Oregon, a small town. And I had gotten to know my patients well. And I sat at my desk about 3 years in practice and looked at the list, and I thought, the people that came in today are being shortchanged because I was shortchanged in my education. It was make a diagnosis, give a pill, make a diagnosis, give a pill all day long. And then if you wanted to be very, very subtle and a great diagnostician, you decided what organ system really needed a pill. When you think about it, that's about the most simple-minded way you could go about doing medicine, but it worked great for the pharmaceutical houses, and almost all my professors that taught me this program actually had funding from the pharmaceutical houses. So it's not surprising that we were educated to make a diagnosis and reach for a pill to give the patient. Actually, it was called prescription interruptus, because the way you got the patient moving along is you gave them a prescription and out the door they went, feeling like they had been shortchanged, but not knowing how to articulate what was shortchanged. Well, there was nothing new about what medicine was about. Osler said it's more important to know the patient than the disease that the patient has. And we had turned that around.
Yes.
And so I sat at my desk that day and realized that I didn't have much to offer patients except pharmacology, because that's what I was trained in. And fortunately, a brochure came across my desk, and it was a gathering of professionals like myself that felt that we did not have a model that really works in the 21st century. Because by that time we knew about DNA, we knew how information was transferred, and we also had this twin studies from the Scandinavian countries, which showed that if you track twins that were separated, identical twins genetically separated at birth, you then had only about 30% of their health history after that separation could be tracked back to their commonality of DNA. So that plus meeting Jeff Bland at the meeting I went to gave me a new track, because I went to that meeting thinking I might quit because I was not going to be the handmaiden of the pharmaceutical industry. And if that's all I could offer patients, they would be better off not having me as their doctor. Fortunately, there was an alternative, and it was, let's ask the question after you make the diagnosis, instead of what pill do you need, why do you have that diagnosis? And we laugh about how primitive we started, because we basically knew that information transfer was through DNA, but the lifestyle, the issues of environment that courses through a person's life is 70%. And then we began to realize that we had to understand how those two merged. How did nature nurture? Nurture being environment, nature being DNA, and that it wasn't one or the other. It was always a conflation of the two. That was the original thing that started this, because at that meeting, there was a lot about nutrition. There was a lot about supplements, because instead of a pharmaceutical house, it was a nutritional house that sponsored it. But at the heart of that was the supposition that Jeff brought, and he was brilliant to have really seen early on, that personalized medicine is where we're going. And we didn't have the tools to do it, but we started. And that's what started us down that road of actually looking for a way to organize information so that you can begin to answer the question, yes, you have the diagnosis of diabetes, but how did you get there? It looks like it's environmental, but back then we didn't have many of the tools that we have now. And then over time, we evolved and brought into our sphere, what are the tools that you can basically personalize the patient's information? But once you say personalized, they're not a Gaussian curve anymore. That's a real person. And then the question is, how do you plumb the depth of that person to actually begin to do something Osler didn't say? In my opinion, what functional medicine has proven is it is equally important to know the underlying science of that diagnosis with the understanding at a deep place who that patient is and what manifestation, why did that manifest in their life, and what is about their life that they might want to actually address. And that's where much of the ideas behind the therapeutic relationship came, because we studied that and studied that and studied that. And it became clear to me in my clinic, because I actually had a family practice, retired 2 years ago after 45 years and 850 babies and a lot of late nights and being in people's home with home births and really getting to know my patients. I realized if you don't know your patients, the uncertainties in medicine, the uncertainties around any scientific study is magnified to where you don't, if you're really honest, you don't know whether they fit under the Gaussian curve and where they fit. And it might be that they would be benefited by what was studied, or they might be the two standard deviations where if you do that, you kill them. And then we're supposed to, as practitioners, deal with that uncertainty with the kind of certainty that comes from the marketing from the pharmaceutical houses. And over time, we had to develop, how do you get over the hurdle of uncertainty? And you can't get completely over it because there's no profession that deals with uncertainty more than we deal with it as clinicians. Everything we say has to be vetted through the sieve of that patient's collaboration. And that's why when I've seen a new patient, I try to explain to them that this is a different kind of way of doing medicine. I know a lot of facts, but it's 72 card pickup unless we start agreeing that you're in charge here. I'm not in charge, you're in charge. You tell me when I'm wrong. And that's a really difficult thing for patients. They're taught doctor is always right. What is this doctor saying? I'm saying that there's any transformational process that occurs in our interaction will occur because we agree that we are two peers with different skill sets that can possibly emerge an answer that's closer to where the real problem is than we could ever do with any kind of statistical analysis of different studies. And that wasn't as well articulated as I sat at my desk that day, but it was the beginning of making a commitment to what are the other things we could put into the portfolio of evaluations and the portfolio of interventions for this patient once a diagnosis is made. So we're taking the idea of diagnosis to the next level, which is why and how. And that's not taught in medical school. It's what groups of pharmaceutical drugs can blunt the progression of this disease, which is, in my opinion, that's the last thing that you fall to if you're really doing good clinical medicine. The why and how is where the real transformation. But you can't find that without the partnership with the patient. You just can't.
That's true. And I will tell you, as a obstetrician gynecologist, my friends thought that I was crazy to go to an integrative medicine, functional medicine class. My motivation was to figure out some of my own health ailments that I acquired in my late 40s. But while in that conference, it was like this great light bulb went off in my head, because we only have 5 to 10 minutes for an OB check, and 15 or maybe 30 minutes for a GYN well woman visit. And for most women in their reproductive age, we are their primary care doctor. Yeah. There's no one else that they see. And when I went through the AFMCP, I learned how to do a better history. You know, everyone right now wants to talk about root cause medicine, mainly because you can submit a sample through the mail and find out your genes and find out why different things are going to happen to you. But it doesn't, it's just not a scientific search or detective work. You can't stop there. And it's great to able to go through and talk with people about what are your triggers, what are your mediators.
Yeah.
You know, I'm the first one in my family who became a doctor, and it was just known in my family that these are just things that happen to us. You know, not why, not, you know, what are we doing with our diet? How is our house? How's the crowding? So just and I realized I thought it would take so much time, but it doesn't take much time if you ask the right questions. Asking like, when were you last well? Or there's so many little techniques that I learned in order to get to that root with the trigger and mediations. And then only if you have a partnership, only if that person feels comfortable with you, are you able to honestly talk about lifestyle modifying habits? Because everyone's going to say, "Oh yeah, doc, I don't eat a lot of sugar, not a lot of cholesterol," but you have to really get in sort of like a friendships type of dialogue to find those things out. And even the obstetrician gynecologist who I used to tell people, don't talk to me about anything unless it's the breast or the pelvis. So even as an OBGYN, I've learned that no, things that are happening in the breast and the pelvis are affected by the gut, that are affected by what food that you eat. And I began again giving better care. And patients loved it, and they felt loved, they felt cared for. So even though the insurance company says we only pay for one visit with this doctor a year, people will come out of their pockets because they'll see the investment. And they'll come back more, and they'll say, "Doc, okay, yeah, remember we said we're going to try 7 hours of sleep, or um, try to remedy this food desert that I'm in. I've seen these changes, but what else can I do? People are like, what else? What else? People love getting control back of their lives.
Yep.
Especially when you see with COVID, the racism in the medical field. And there are a lot of Black and brown people, actually all races of people. I have white patients too, keep asking me, why are Black people having a problem here? Why? Because I'm Hispanic. Am I guaranteed to be a diabetic? And no one's going to tell me how not to. So a lot of good questions have been coming up, and it's putting a light on a lot of stupid things that we do as Americans, like with our diet, and put us in the driver's seat. So we're not victims. That's and I appreciate you teaching me that.
Well, you're welcome, because you can't imagine what a pleasure it is when I see the light go on for people like the light went on for me. I somewhere in, and I think at different meetings, I ask people, do you feel like you had a calling? Are you a doctor because you had a calling? I think most doctors raise their hand. They feel like they have a calling. Well, what happened to it? Why does the pharmaceutical industry own you now? What happened to your calling? And do you feel like you're on the path of that calling by passing out drugs instead of getting in the trenches with the patient and actually understanding who they are, what their life is, and coming up with possible answers that fit that life? And one of the things that we see at our meetings is that people come because they have heard that in functional medicine, there's something special going on. And it's not just the patient that wants the freedom. It's we as doctors want the freedom to do what we know is right and quit violating that calling that we felt.
Right.
We violate it every day in our clinics because we don't listen, and we don't get down and dirty with what is that person's life like.
Right.
I mean, what I know about people of color, I learned from my patients, but I had to listen to stories that were gut-wrenching. Mm-hmm. Because they said, no one ever asked me that before. Well, how could you possibly, with some of the stories that I heard, how could you possibly not take that into consideration in how you both make a diagnosis and try together to configure a way out of the conundrums that go with living under stress? There was a study early on in our work at IFM that showed that if you controlled everything except one group was a group of color and the other one was a bunch of Caucasians, there's a 30% disparity. And that it took 3 decades for the term social determinants of health to actually come into our vocabulary as doctors. And most doctors say, well, that's a public health officer's problem. That's not my problem. If that's not a problem you're addressing, then you're not doing personalized medicine. You're just doing routine, make a diagnosis, give a pill. Mm-hmm. And that is got to be the most boring thing that you could possibly do. Because often the way I tell the mindset of a doctor is, are your avocations, now that you've been out in practice for 10, 20 years, are your avocations as important or more important than your work as a doctor? If they then launch into their inspiring statement about what their avocation is, I realize, oh my God, they gave up. They gave up because there's nothing more compelling than the honesty that can occur, what I call the magic of medicine. The way that I did clinical medicine, I would look at the chart and go through my notes from the last visit and look at the labs that had come in. And then I would go to the door And just for a minute, I close my eyes and say, David, you know a lot about this patient. Can you get out of the way of magic occurring today because you know too much?
Mm.
And what I really meant was, can you listen instead of knowing, oh yeah, there it goes again. There goes Mildred again. There's her problem. No, magic occurs where you get there with them and you literally feel them. Because when that happens, I always got shivers. I knew whether David actually did it or not. I mean, if I went in the room and walked out, boy, I got through that one. I got to get on to the next one. I know that, boy, that person should fire me.
Well, I appreciate that because I grew up in a very poor community, had lead poisoning as a young child, had sugar, grew up on Tang and Kool-Aid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Crisco, just a lot of things that were normal. And no one ever asked what we ate or what our water supply was. There were never questions. There were just prescriptions. And I went into medicine because I felt the burden of my cousins who were dying from sickle cell, or people in their 50s and 60s getting amputations because of their diabetes. And I went because I said, I don't want to fall in the same health abyss as the rest of my family. And I wanted to help my family members. And
yeah.
Being the first one to graduate from medical school, everyone says, oh, you uplifted your family, but you don't uplift your family by graduating, you uplift your family by teaching your family.
Yep.
And so that has been really impactful. And then the other thing that is, I don't think is said enough, is that as an OBGYN, what you're telling me about not experiment, but the exposure to allergens, to toxins, what you have been taught about overcrowding, what I've been taught about stress. There's a lot of stress. I was around when Martin Luther King died in my neighborhood, riot, ramsack. And now we have racial unrest again. And I have young Black boys who are affected mentally about their safety. So stress that goes from generation to generation.
Mm-hmm.
And as OBGYNs, we more so than anybody should know functional medicine, because we're not only changing the life of one patient, but you're changing the trajectory in the life of that baby growing inside them, as well as the eggs and sperm that are growing inside the baby that's inside of you. I mean, you're treating technically 3 generations of people in one visit.
Yep.
And that makes more time and more of a therapeutic relationship even more important than just the amount of time that we have.
So do you have an example in your life as a doctor where you realized, oh my God, I am pushing the formalism of modern conventional medicine, and the patient didn't get better, and then the patient taught you what you needed to know? Do you have an example of that?
I have a couple, but the one that comes to my mind first has to do with my work doing international medicine.
Uh-huh.
And I remember going to Landui, Jamaica,
Uh-huh.
and we bring all our samples of blood pressure and diabetes medicine. And I'm talking to, and it's only a month's supply, but I'm talking to the patient and I say, don't eat any more sugar cane. They're like, no, not going to do it. Don't eat, there's a type of fish, there's a lot of salt. Don't eat that and take this medicine. And they just honestly said, no. And it was so frustrating because I'm like, why am I here to just give you medicine for a chronic disease for just 1 month? And I talked to one of the organizers, and she told me, no, you need to talk to them. Where do they live? Do they live with family members? Where do they get their food source? So the next day I said, what can you eat besides sugar cane? You know, what vegetables do you grow? Um, does your neighbor have a chicken? Can you share eggs? And it was, the patient was just so excited that I was interested in this, interested in where they grew. And then I didn't come as like the great American doctor with these magic pills, but I I did more and more of these trips because I learned how to teach people where they're at,
Mhm.
that they can have good health. So that made me start to listen more,
Yeah.
and before I write the prescription for people.
And I think from what you just said, you've had the experience I had, that we walk in with a lot of information and we don't know how to use that information. We weren't taught how to use that information. We were taught to use it to manipulate the environment. We used words that people didn't understand. So you mystify how incredible we are. And then the list just goes on and on. When you get down with patients and really listen to where they live, it not only creates a therapeutic relationship, because before that it's a technical relationship.
Mhm.
Therapeutic relationship then opens the possibility of the placebo effect. We play games with the placebo effect because the pharmaceutical industry plays games with it all the time. But it is our strongest ally. And I feel like there's many times I don't do anything except quietly listening, walk along, holding the hand of a person going through the valley of shadow of their change. And I
It's
don't
so
know,
important. Yeah.
they come back and tell me that what I said, and it doesn't really matter what I said. They were ready to hear what they wanted to hear to change their life. And creating a context by listening was much more powerful than creating a context of how bright I am and how much I know.
Mhm. And my greatest joy being an obstetrician, and I delivered over 3,000 babies, but my greatest joy is that now that um, I'm much older, in my late 50s, I get cards or messages through social media from Black teenage girls who I delivered in Baltimore
Yep.
during my training and early practice. I'll get messages from them uh, about their children that I delivered, and how they're so much more healthy. They're so much more intellectual um, than they were, and the um, the things that I taught them when they were teenagers in the 80s in Baltimore, they're now teaching that child I delivered. So that child has a better delivery,
Yep.
and so I feel like a grandma to a lot of children.
Because in many ways you are.
People get excited when you change their life, and I thought it would take a lot to change someone's life, but just like you said, just listening,
Yep.
um, validate someone, and makes a big difference.
Well, that is a great way to kind of tie this all together at the end. There's a increasing understanding that knowing the patient at a deep level is fundamental to functional medicine. And if you learn nothing more than the importance of listening, functional medicine has helped you become a real doctor. And then if you care enough about your patients, you'll wade through the biochemistry and find out what works and what doesn't work. But you're not going to put that kind of effort in if you don't care. And if you don't care, there is no therapeutic relationship. It's a technical relationship.
Right.
And so they hoped, Darlene, that we would talk about the history of functional medicine and also talk about the therapeutic relationship. And you have done an absolutely elegant job of describing your life, transitions that you've gone through, and the power that comes, power in terms of being an agent of change without deluding yourself that you heal somebody. There's something bigger about healing than you and me, but
Yes.
we can create a context where that greater essence occurs. And if we're dumb enough to take credit for it, then we're going to have problems with our ego down the road. But if we acknowledge that there's nothing more exciting for me, and I can tell it's true for you, than to be being able and having the skills to create a context where people tumble to what's the burr under their saddle. And then we talk about, are there some ideas that we can help in terms of how do you get that burr out from under your saddle without giving you a drug that just modifies the symptoms of that problem. And I think what a pleasure to have spent the morning with you.
Thank you. The last thing I really want to say to you is I genuinely really appreciate that you and Dr. Bland put together a model that can fit any field of medicine. It's not just something for family practitioners, but all of us doctors, no matter our chosen field, can use this to better the health of a person. And there's no greater joy than that.
The last thing I would like to say is there's no greater joy for me. And I do want to say that it wasn't Jeff Bland and I get a lot of credit. It was all of you that gathered around a good idea and actually evolved it. Talk about a village. You have to have a village to raise a kid. You have to have a village to do what we're doing. And it's the people that have gathered around this idea that proves to me that the idea is correct, because the quality of the people like you that have come, you can't imagine what that does for my heart, that we spent that time and something good came of it.
For sure, definitely. And I thank you.
Thank you.